All right. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. And let's see. It's great to see so many familiar faces. Alyssa was my old boss at Google. Though I don't think she's skipping my talk, but Jeffrey, good to see Jeffrey as well. And I'm going to sum up. This is my book. Everybody Lies is about 5 years of research. I actually started my PhD program about all the things we can learn about human nature from the internet, from internet data. And I'm gonna start with a story that's not my own research, and it's not from internet data, and it's not even about human beings. It's about horses. But I like the story, and hopefully you learn some things from it. So this is American Pharoah. In 2015, American Pharoah became the first horse in 37 years to win the Triple Crown. But when he was a 1-year-old horse, he didn't look like anything special. He was up for an auction, and nobody thought he was a particularly special horse. He had about average statistics and height and weight and pedigree, and he was sold for about an average price at that auction. So nobody thought there was anything special about American Pharoah except for this guy, Jeff Sater. Jeff Sater has 3 degrees from Harvard. When he was 26 years old, he was working at Citibank, and he looked at himself in the mirror wearing like a suit and tie, and he said, "This just isn't me." And he quit his job and moved to rural Pennsylvania and decided he wanted to be around horses in the woods. And he became obsessed with this quest to figure out what it is that makes a great racehorse great, and whether he could predict it from statistics and data science. This is before Moneyball and before a lot of that. So he started on his approach many decades ago. The first thing he looked at was the size of horses' nostrils. He had an idea. I think it's pretty natural that bigger nostrils would allow horses to breathe better, and this maybe would be a predictor that they're going to be a great horse. And he collected what I think is still to this day, the world's largest horse nostril data set ever collected. He correlated it with the eventual performance of the horses, and he found out that horse nostril does not predict how good a horse will be. Oh, didn't work. Sorry. I think I'm one behind in this. All right. He looked at the volume of fast twitch muscles, another natural thing to look at. Built a data set of that, can correlate with horse performance, found once again that it does not work. He was a weird guy. He is a weird guy. I met him in Ocala, Florida. I think he'll be okay, saying that me saying he's a little bit of an eccentric fellow. He had a theory that the size of horses' defecations would predict how good they'd end up being. He tried to explain to me the reasoning behind this, and I couldn't understand it. But something in his mind convinced him that this was potentially a big predictor of horse success. So he sat outside the barns and measured how big their defecations were, put that in the database with how good the horses ended up, and found out that did not predict how well a horse will do. Many decades into his project, he built the world's first ultrasound to measure the internal organs of horses and how big they are. And one of the things in this ultrasound could measure the size of their hearts and the size of the different chambers of their hearts, and including the size of their left ventricle. He correlated this with how well the horses did, and he found out that left ventricle was a major predictor of horse success and how eventually they performed. So which brings us back to American Pharoah. Jeff Sater was advising the owner of American Pharoah, who was putting the horse up for auction. And he showed me, when I met with him in Ocala, Florida, the card he had an American Pharoah as a 1-year-old when he was in his database. And you can see that American Pharoah was, you probably can't see. Sorry, those are small numbers, but this isn't going to be as dramatic with the size of these numbers. But American Pharoah, I can't even see on my screen what these numbers are. I think he had a 56 percentile height, a 61st percentile weight, and a 70th percentile pedigree, which is what everybody else saw about him and thought he was an average horse. But Jeff Sater, with his ultrasound and his model, knew that his left ventricle was 99.61st percentile. And actually, in his model, he found that pretty much most horses that have left ventricles that big have an illness, have a disease, and just every other organ is tiny, and they just have basically a large left ventricle. But with American Pharoah, all the organs were big or pretty big, and then his left ventricle was enormous. So he told the guy who he's advising, don't sell your horse, sell your house. This is basically a once in a generation horse, and clearly he was right. So what lessons can we learn from Jeff Sater's story? I think one thing, as data scientists, one thing I take away from it is frequently the value of a data set is not its size, it is its newness. Jeff Sater's data set on horses is only tens of thousands of horses within the age of big data, and we've been seeing millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions. Is not an enormous data set, but he has something new about horses that other people don't have, that the other analysts don't have, which turns out to be a really important predictor. The winners in the world of big data are entrepreneurial. There are a lot of people in the horsing world who would probably consider themselves data scientists because they analyze all the metrics that we've always had on horses: how fast they ran their first race, how tall they were, how much they weighed, how their parents did, and built models on that to see how good a horse they are. But they get wiped away by Jeff Sater, who actually put energy into measuring all these various new things about horses. You fail a lot on the way to find the big winner. Really, really important. You don't just wake up the first day, you have your left ventricle and you can call it a day. You have to measure the nostril and measure the muscles. You have to shovel poop on the way to the left ventricle is one way to I think we can think about this. And I think the cool thing about this story is there really are left ventricles out there. There are variables that if you know that, you have not just a 5% better model, not just a 10% better model, maybe 50, 60% better model than everybody else, if you found it. And so my job now, since I quit Google, is to kind of go around and give talks to corporations and consult and give lectures like this. And one of the main things I'm learning is that Google's food is way better than everybody else's. But another thing I'm learning is that people really like this Jeff Sater horse story, which is why I'm starting with it. And they start saying afterwards in the data science meetings, they say, what is our left ventricle and how are we going to find it? And I like that. I think that's a good way to think of a data scientist job, is you're in the business of finding the left ventricle of your area and using probably some of the lessons that we can take from Jeff Sater. All right. But most of people in this audience are not trying to predict horse success. You're trying to understand human beings. And when you try to understand human beings, you have to remember that everybody lies, which is the theme of the title of my book and the theme of a lot of the work I've done. And they do lie to surveys. So the main way to understand the human psyche over the last 80 years, if you want to know what people want, why they do the things they do, what they're going to do in the future, you ask them, you conduct a survey. Usually I don't give this to a room full of survey people. So now I'm scared and get tomatoes thrown in my face as I attack your entire careers. No. It's so obviously everyone here knows there's Gallup, there's Pew, many of the surveys here are represented. This is the window into the human psyche. But people lie to these sources. And there are many examples of this, as I'm sure you all know. My favorite example, because it's a little R-rated, maybe I'll spice up our cocktail hour a little bit, talk a little about sex. There's a lot of sex in the book as well, if anyone's interested in that topic. And the General Social Survey asks people every 2 years about their sexual behavior. They ask people how frequently they have sex, how frequently they use a condom, whether it's heterosexual and homosexual sex. You can do the math on this. Women in the United States every year, women report they have sex an average of once a week and use a condom 20% of the time. You do the math. In this heterosexual sex, they're saying they use 1.1 billion condoms every year in heterosexual sex in the United States. Do the exact same thing for men, and they report 1.6 billion condoms every year in heterosexual sexual encounters. You kind of see by definition, those have to be the same. So you already know that somebody's not telling the truth, that somebody's lying. So who's telling the truth, men or women? Neither. Nielsen actually calculates how many condoms are sold. Only 600 million condoms are sold every year in the United States, some of them to gay men and some of them thrown out. So a lot of men are, so basically everybody's now lying about sex. This doesn't mean that they're lying about how frequently, are they lying about how frequently they have sex or how frequently they use a condom? I think it's more the frequency of sex, because if you ask people how frequently they have sex with women of pregnancy age using absolutely no contraception, and you do scientific estimates of how frequently people are supposed to get pregnant, if that was true, there would be about 2 or 3 times more pregnancies every year in the United States. So I think everybody basically just feels the pressure to exaggerate how much sex they're having. All right, but now we do have a new source into a new window into the human psyche, which is people's Google searches or Bing searches. Sorry. And because we all know many people who use Bing. And Google offers what I call digital truth serum, which is that people are remarkably honest to Google, and they tell things to Google that they might not tell anybody else, things they might not tell friends, family members, doctors, surveys. They confess things to Google. And I think a lot of surveys, the main approach to understand people, which is surveys, I think is going to be not replaced, but I think massively supplemented by, I think, Google searches and Google Trends, which is something that Jeffrey Ray talked about and some other people have talked about, and a lot of people, more and more people are using. And I think still is an underutilized source and still is really powerful as a window into the human psyche. All right, another R-rated example. Sorry, I do too many R-rated examples, but it gets my point across that this is on Google Trends. There are more search for porn than weather. Even though if you ask people in a survey, about 20% of men and 4% of women say they watch porn, presumably 100% say they check the weather. But so very different view of people on Google Trends than you see in surveys. And there are many examples, particularly on the sensitive areas, where Google is proving better than surveys and has been proven better. So one example is predicting who will turn out and vote. That came up a lot in the earlier sessions, that it's really challenging because people tend to lie and say they're going to vote, even if they don't have any intention to vote, or they're convinced they're lying to themselves. They're thinking they're going to vote. They're going to exercise their civic duty. And, I think there's some talk about using previous voting behavior as the best metric of who will vote, but that's not good because there are sometimes changes in the electorate, which can be really important. So you want to capture those as well. And this actually I wrote in my dissertation, was that you can predict with very high accuracy and much better with surveys how high turnout in an area is going to be based on searches for vote or voting, how to vote, where to vote, polling places. The people who are really close on the margin of voting decisions tend to need to look up to get information on how to vote. So a really high predictor of turnout. I think that is one of the factors. Obviously, a lot of people did more on this than I do, but it is one of the factors. And I think why Hillary Clinton underperformed in certain areas is that African-American turnout was lower than a lot of surveys predicted. And I actually did predict in a New York Times column that was going to come to pass, because if you looked at searches for how to vote, where to vote, these searches for turnout, they were way down. We don't have individual data. We have cities that are 95% Black. And you saw before this election a huge drop in these searches, and the turnout was going to be much lower than people realized among African Americans. And I think that is one of the reasons that Hillary Clinton did do worse than a lot of people predicted. Predicting who is at risk of suicide. I'm working on a column on this now. Someone wrote an academic paper kind of starting this idea that you can predict, they showed that you can predict suicide rates much higher with Google searches on suicidal ideation than you can with asking people, do you have suicidal ideation? So obviously really important public health implications from that. Measuring racism. This is how I actually started my research in Google Trends when I was a PhD student. This is the first paper I wrote, which I studied racist searches on Google. And this is the percent of Google searches that include the N-word, not the N-word, like the actual word. And when I started doing this research, it was 2012. It was this idea we lived in a post-racial society. So I was shocked. I was also kind of naive. I was shocked by how frequently people are making racist searches on Google. They were searching for this really nasty word with the same frequency in the time period I was looking at as they were searching for migraine and Economist and Lakers and Daily Show. So not a fringe search, but millions of people Americans were making this search. I was also kind of shocked with not just the frequency with which people are making this search, but the location of these searches. If you had asked me what a map of racism in the United States looked like, I would have said it would be predominantly concentrated in the Deep South. In this map, darker red means more racism, lighter red means less racism. I would have said it would be predominantly concentrated in the Deep South. And you do see some of the top areas of racist searches on Google do include southern Mississippi and southern Louisiana and parts of South Carolina. But right up there with that are parts of Pennsylvania and industrial Michigan and West Virginia and upstate New York. I think if you had to divide the country into two regions of racism today in the United States, it wouldn't necessarily be north versus south. It'd be more east versus west. You see it's much lighter in the western part of the country than the eastern part of the country. And also, this is not searching for rap lyrics, which tend to use the version of the word that ends in A. That's what I initially thought it was, but that gives a very different map of racism in the United States. So anyway, I wrote this up. It was kind of considered a little bit sacrilegious to use Google searches back in the day, so it kind of got ignored. I'm not bitter or anything, but it got ignored. it doesn't really matter because it's an important topic, but it got ignored by the academic research, and it's considered kind of crazy that there are all these secret explicit racists in the United States. And then we had a certain presidential candidate recently, if anyone's paying attention, who said some racially charged things, and everyone thought he was going to lose, and he didn't. And Nate Cohn is a data journalist at the New York Times, collected data on support for Trump in the Republican primary, and he asked me if he could get the data on racism and correlate the two, and he found that of all the variables he could test, and Nate Silver said the same thing, of all the variables they tested on support for Trump in the Republican primary, the number one biggest predictor was racist Google searches, more than economic variables or demographics. And I know there was a talk earlier about how some polls have also said that racism was a factor, which I'm sure you can pick this up a little bit in some of the polls, but I think for various reasons, Google's shows a stronger effect, and it's probably more. I think it's a little more. Sometimes the questions that people ask in surveys about racism, because it's such a sensitive topic and because people don't like admitting it, tend to be correlated with other things like your support of government policies and stuff. But this is pretty much right on target. If you're searching for end jokes, that's pretty direct, I think, racist attitude that's going to be hard to pick up in any other way. All right. So one thing I like to emphasize is that all big data is not the same. I think a lot of people lump together very different data sources and put them together in the rubric of big, new, important data sets that are going to revolutionize our understanding of the human psyche. And I don't totally agree with that. I think Google is digital truth serum. Like I said, people are so honest on Google, they tell things that they don't tell to anyone else. But I think the other biggest data set that exists now, Facebook, I wouldn't really call that digital truth serum. I call that digital brag to my friends about how good my life is serum. Because on Google, I think on Google, people are kind of more honest. They're alone. On Facebook, they're talking to all their friends. They're basically trying to make themselves look as good as possible. And you see over and over again, and I've attacked all the survey research, and now I'm going to attack the Facebook. All your talks I really did find very interesting. And there are like value in all different approaches to data, but there is a problem, I think, in Facebook data in how you interpret it. It's more aspirational. It's not realistic, in my opinion. And that it does not really correspond to reality frequently. So I've done all kinds of comparisons on this, but this is one of them. You can compare the National Enquirer, kind of a gossipy, trashy magazine, and the Atlantic Monthly, kind of a serious intellectual magazine, and see how popular they are. We actually know how popular they are because we have official ground truth circulation data on the two magazines. And we know from ground truth data that the National Enquirer is 3 times more popular than the Atlantic Monthly as far as how much people are buying them and presumably reading them. But on Facebook, where people are showing off to their friends when they're liking things or posting about things, which you think is more popular, maybe not surprisingly, Atlantic is 45 times more popular according to Facebook than the National Enquirer. And people kind of, these are methodologies people hammer me about differences in selection group. I don't think there are 45 times more. There are 45 times differences in population in these two sources. So I think a big part of what's going on is that people want their friends to think they're really intellectual and more intellectual than they are. I like to compare the two different sources. The one that I hate, the Facebook digital brags my friends how good my life is serum, and the Google search data, which is digital truth serum. And it's kind of interesting and sometimes maybe a little bit amusing to compare how people come across on the two different big data sources. So my favorite example is I compared how people describe their husbands on the different sources. So if you kind of complete the phrase, my husband is, and you start with my husband is on Facebook, the number one way people describe their husbands on Facebook. Anyone have a guess? Awesome. The best, close enough. The best, my best friend is number 2. Number 3, my husband's amazing, the greatest, and so cute. So that's kind of the view of marriage on Facebook, which is definitely an interesting view of marriage. And then you can compare that on Google. So that's where people are talking to their friends and about their relationships. And you can compare that on Google, where people are by themselves. They're not showing off to their friends. How do they describe how are husbands described on Google? Actually, the 3rd most popular description of husbands on Google is amazing. So that one kind of checks out. But the other, rounding out the top 5 of descriptors of husbands on Google, is gay, a jerk, annoying, and mean. So that's kind of an interesting contrast. And I think just kind of the point of this is not necessarily that that's the right view of marriage, and that Google's the right view of marriage and Facebook's the wrong view of marriage, but they're definitely different. And you do have to think of the incentives of your data set. That Facebook, people are talking to their friends. Google, they're kind of anonymous and trying to get information. You get a different view of marriage according to the different sources. But I think any big data source, whether it's Facebook, Google, there is another value in it. Forget about the people lying and the deception. I think that is an important value, which really is only useful with the Google data. But another value of big data sources is zooming in. This is one of my favorite maps that's ever been produced by big data. It's by the New York Times. The Upshot group is they create a map of the most popular baseball team in every zip code of the United States. This is based on Facebook likes data. It's beautiful, beautiful map. The guy who makes it is just insanely talented. But Josh Katz made it. And this is actually, they zoomed in on different borders. So this is the popularity of the Orioles and Nationals, the Baltimore team and the Washington D.C. team by zip code in the Washington D.C. area. And obviously, the huge value of this big data is that you have big samples for every zip code. So if you did a survey of 2,000 people, it's come a lot in the conference, but you just survey 2,000 people, 10,000 people, even I think Mark's with 3 million people, you're not necessarily going to have big enough samples for small populations. But because Facebook has everybody, has I think 160 million Americans or something like that, they really do have big samples for even small subsets of the populations by zip code. You can also zoom in by age is another. I did a study. You can actually figure out when people become baseball fans, because you can download basically the most popular from Facebook's ad setting. You can download the most popular baseball team for people of every age. So people who are 32 years old or 33 years old, 34 years old. So basically, knowing what year they were born. And you see, for example, that the New York Mets are most popular among people who were born in 1978 and 1961. And the New York Mets won World Series in 1969 and 1986. So both those groups were 8 years old when the Mets won the World Series. And you see that over and over again in the different groups. And you obviously need a huge amount of data to have the number of Mets fans among 32-year-olds and 33-year-olds and 34-year-olds. You're not going to have that with a survey, which, usually with age in a survey, it's bucketed into 18 to 29-year-olds or 30 to 44-year-olds or whatever. You're not going to be able to do that in a survey. Another tool that everyone here knows A/B testing, right? I'm just going to skip it. I think this is my favorite study using big data, kind of putting together a lot of the different tool sets. It's a study of Islamophobia that I did with Evan Soltas, who was then at Princeton University. And you see that that people make on Google, not necessarily a lot of people, but not a non-trivial number of people, make really, really nasty searches about Muslim Americans. They search things like kill Muslims, or I hate Muslims, or Muslims are evil, or why are Muslims terrorists, or Muslims must die. Really, really nasty, disturbing stuff about Muslim Americans. And these searches seem kind of weird. Do they mean anything? But Evan and I showed that they actually predict hate crimes against Muslim Americans. So on weeks when more people are making searches for kill Muslims, there are more attacks on mosques and Muslims being killed and really, really nasty stuff. So these seemingly weird, kind of crazy searches do have real predictive power in the world. And there was a period where these Islamophobic searches got out of control. It was December 2015. I don't know if y'all remember the attack on the San Bernardino Mosque, where 2 Muslim Americans shot up a group of people, one of the guy's coworkers, and killed, I think, 14 people. And you see immediately after that, in many sources, but including on Google, there was an explosion in these really angry, rageful searches about Muslim Americans. So the top search with the word Muslims in it, literally minutes after they announced that the shooters had Muslim sounding names, was kill Muslims. So these nasty searches were kind of getting out of control. And Barack Obama, I think, we once had a president who actually tried to lower hate in the country, but Barack Obama, I think, knew that there was a problem of Islamophobia, and he gave a speech about this, and it was a nationally televised speech. It got a lot of attention, and it was really, I thought, like, I'm a big Obama. Full disclosure, I'm a big Obama supporter, but I thought, even on the scale of Obama's speeches, I thought this was one of the better ones, and that when I saw it, I thought it was one of the most moving, one of the most beautiful, one of the most compelling, how he talked about the responsibility that Americans have to reject discrimination. He talked about it as our responsibility to not give in to fear, to appeal to freedom, how it's who we are as a country, how we should not judge people based on their religion when deciding whether they're going to come into this country, and all these things. And it got great reviews. I was the only one who thought it was a great speech. Boston Globe and Think Progress and New York Times and LA Times all said, great job. Obama done all his great job by giving this beautiful speech, kind of talking about really how the evils of discrimination. So Evan Soltis and I were actually studying Islamophobia during this speech, and we realized because Google Trends is broken down minute by minute, we could actually see what was the response in these nasty searches about Muslims during and after the speech. So we looked at the data, and we found out that during and after Obama's speech, the nasty search about Muslim Americans, kill Muslims, I hate Muslims, Muslims must die, they didn't drop. They didn't even stay the same. They went way up. So basically everything Obama was doing in that speech seemed to actually be backfiring. And that's kind of a pessimistic conclusion, as is most of my book is horribly pessimistic. And but I think my publisher at some point said I had to put something find some cheery things in the data, so people wouldn't just be horrified and depressed. So I did, but we did actually find something a little more. We did find something a little more a little more potentially optimistic in the data, which is at the end of the speech that Obama gave about Islamophobia. He said how Muslim Americans are our friends and neighbors. They're our sports heroes, and they're the men and women who will die for our country. And you see immediately after he gave that line, a huge explosion of searches for Muslim athletes and Muslim soldiers. In fact, for weeks later, for the first time in many years, the top descriptor of Muslim on Google was not Muslim terrorists or Muslim extremists. It was Muslim athletes followed by Muslim soldiers, and these kept the top 2 spots for more than a week afterwards. So I think we were working on a New York Times column on this, and we said maybe there are 2 kind of different approaches to calming hate. If you think of the first, kind of the main gist of the speech that seemed to backfire, it used words like responsibility and should. It was kind of lecturing people and giving people information that they had heard 1,000 times. And you compare that to the final line that seemed to maybe have a more positive effect. It was offering new information, provoking people's curiosity, changing how they feel about a group that's causing them so much rage. And we published that idea in the New York Times. I don't think it's crazy when you publish something in the New York Times that powerful people read that, and possibly even someone in Obama's staff, because about 6 days later, Islamophobia was not getting any better, and Obama gave another speech. Again, it was on national TV. This one was at a Baltimore mosque. Again, it got a lot of attention. But if you read that speech, it was basically totally different from the first speech, in that he basically stopped all the lecturing. He stopped talking about the responsibility people have, the things they should do, stopped telling people things they've been told 1,000 times about Muslim Americans. And he really instead doubled down on the curiosity strategy. He talked about Muslim Americans helped build our country, and they're farmers and merchants, and Muslim Americans built the skyscraper in Chicago, and Thomas Jefferson had a copy of the Quran, and all these new views of Muslims. And you did see, if you look at what happened to Islamophobic searches, there was a drop in most of the searches after Obama, in the hours and days following Obama's speech. So I'm not saying from this study of 2 speeches that I've solved hatred in the world. And obviously a lot more research has to be done, but I do think it shows the really revolutionary power of some of these new internet data sources, where if you utilize the combination of people are so honest and confessing all these strange, weird thoughts onto Google, and then we have them minute by minute, we can really kind of see what's going on, as a president talks. I think it does show that we're really turning some really difficult questions, like how to calm an angry mob, into much more of a real science. And I think you're going to be seeing more and more of that, where questions that we really haven't had a good idea of what worked, we've been kind of going based on our intuition. They seem so difficult to study. With some of these new data sources, you really can get new important insights into them. So so that's my book. Everybody Lies. There's a lot more in that, but that's kind of the theme of the stuff that I've been researching and talking about. I think we're gonna do a Q&A.
Does anyone have a question? We'll shout it out while we. Oh, here's the microphone.
He brings his own chair. What a speaker.
Hi, I have a question about returning to that people are lying in the surveys. So I know that when you're expecting that respondents will potentially lie because the question is uncomfortable, like for example, in medical studies, when they're asking about HIV, what they're sometimes doing is when they're designing the survey, they can throw a coin and with 50% chance for each respondent, you should either only tell the truth or with 50% chance you can either tell the truth or lie, just up to you. And then basically there's no, so it becomes way more comfortable answering truth. What do you think about this kind of setup?
Yeah, so that's list experiments or randomized response. And I'm pretty skeptical of those. I think it's kind of, first of all, I think the thing is so confusing to people who are doing the surveys that it's like, you know, they're doing Bayesian calculations on how the chances that you can figure out what I'm doing. Is just a weird environment. And also, I was initially skeptical, and then Andrew Gelman wrote a blog post where he basically attacked these approaches and said that he has file draws of like these things that didn't work. Or he said that, or that other people have emailed them that they also constantly doing these experiments and getting nonsensical answers. So I don't know, you know, I'd be willing to be proven wrong if that's, you know, if people can, but I'm skeptical of those from that Andrew Gelman post. And also it just seems like a little bit, you know, people don't want to be honest. It's not like they're, so I think one of the reasons, like with a survey, you're not really ever going to have an incentive to tell the truth. You don't necessarily have an incentive to lie, except that you think that maybe someone's going to figure this out or whatever, but you have no incentive to tell the truth. So you just assume lie, and frequently people lie to themselves too. If you ask people, are you going to vote in 2 weeks? You might think you're voting, even though you have no idea how to vote and haven't looked up how to vote or where to vote or know anything about this. So that's another issue. But I think the reason that Google is so powerful in terms of getting people to confess things is it gives you an incentive to tell the truth. So you have to tell the truth to get the information you need.
It seems like bash surveys overall, and the Google trend is the way to go. It seems where you're going, which I'm just wondering, is there a role in your mind for survey research? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, so there, initially I did just bash surveys and said Google's the answer, because also I was like a little bit younger, and you know, I thought I had all the answers and stuff. And now that I am actually, I'm kind of changing my tune a little bit, because you know, I'm supposed to write columns on things we can learn from people's Google searches, and I haven't thought of anything to find in like a few months. I've totally run out of ideas, and every time I get these emails, they're usually from my mom, like of an idea of something that you can work on, like, oh, can you see how many people support gun control using Google searches? I'm like, I have no idea how to figure out how many people support gun control using Google searches. So I maybe can see the geographic variation somehow, but like, it's not like just any question. You can just, I can just say, hey, like, there's some easy way to answer with Google Trends data. So I do think that some of the future may be combining the data sources like Jeffrey and some other people, Robin, I guess we're talking about the combination of different data sources. Maybe if you could, like, you know, yeah, like match up answers with Google, you know, survey answers with Google data. And there are some like non-sensitive issues where, you know, I don't think people are gonna lie. Although I do think a huge problem with surveys is that just people answer randomly or don't really put any thought to it, because you don't have an incentive to give truthful information. So like I've taken like 1,000 Google surveys, because I don't know who has only taken 2 or 3 of these. Every site I need to go to, I have to take a survey to go to it. And I always just click a random answer. And I'm not, they apparently have ways to take that out of the data, but I'm not totally convinced that they're taking me out of this data set. So I think that is a huge issue with even non-sensitive questions.
I was wondering if you've done any trend analysis on speeches from the current administration and something that you might recommend through Fox and Friends.
Yeah, no, I haven't. I mean, there's a lot more to be done, and I haven't really looked too much of some of the response to Trump. I do think that in general, Trump has probably causes a lot less than people think. I think he was a response to a lot of stuff that, if anything, Obama caused more of. And I'm not saying Obama's at fault for this. I think if you kind of look at the racism data, for example, like these searches really rose in November 2008 when Obama was first elected. And they didn't. Some of this stuff wasn't rising when Trump was like trying to rile people up. So I think, I wonder if Trump made the same speech, if it wouldn't have the same effect in getting people mad at Muslim Americans. I think something about Obama really made people angry, and Trump really capitalized on that more than created it.
How do you distinguish between people lying and people not knowing the answer?
Yeah, I don't know. There's kind of a, yeah, I don't know. It's good. To some degree, it doesn't really matter if you're just trying to get the truth, like what the reason is. And then there's a question, if you're lying to yourself, is that really lying? And, I think the sexual behavior stuff, you could imagine that some people are kind of rounding up by a factor of 4 or 5, but, in their head, like without really thinking they're lying. But I do think, I don't know that it totally matters. Lying to yourself or deliberately lying, whether you're conscious or not conscious of the giving the wrong answer. I think.
Lying to yourself if you don't know the answer. You still haven't enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, that's also an interesting thing as kind of brought up with the Trump. So maybe I should talk about the predict.
I'm not talking about Trump. I'm talking about in general.
No, but like the undecided.
Motives.
Yeah,
Why they do something. People don't know why they do things.
Well, I think that's also.
Yeah, why did I just do that?
It's not as good of a title as everybody's confused. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think people that kind of strikes me as a little bit of lying to oneself, but to some degree, I'm not sure it totally makes the difference. I do think, like with the Trump and undecided voters, like I do wonder if there are ways to pick out from people's internet behavior that people maybe knew before they realized who they were going to support. So I've done this research on trying. That's like the number one question I get: can you use Google to predict elections? And I'm not really an expert on predicting stuff because I'm such a pessimist. I predicted Trump would win, but I predict an asteroid is going to hit New York City next week. I'm like always predicting whatever bad is going to happen. I'm predicting it. So there is like Simon Rogers, this guy at Google. I don't know, and that does a lot with predicting. And I think has had some success with this. Some of the main, like the original approaches that they're trying to do to predict elections with search data was just see how frequently people search for the candidate. And that clearly doesn't work for the obvious reason that you could, if you search for a candidate, you could love that candidate or you could hate for that candidate. So that doesn't really work. But one thing indicator I looked at with this guy, Stuart Gabriel at UCLA, economist, it's kind of an interesting indicator. I don't know how useful it's going to be in the future, but it's definitely just interesting, is that there's a big correlation between the order in which you search candidates. So 26% of the searches for Clinton in the previous election cycle also include the word Trump. People search for Clinton-Trump polls or Clinton-Trump debate, but people also search for Trump-Clinton polls or Trump-Clinton debate. And you can see very, very clearly in all the previous elections, whichever candidate goes first is going to get more votes in that area. So like not just at the country level, like whichever candidate comes first wins, and then also at the state level, like if you correlated, whoever comes first most in that state does better.
Top of mind awareness survey comes first.
Right, exactly. But I think that maybe there are some people who think that they're undecided, but would give it away in the way they search about. Like that's why I got excited about that. That maybe there are people who are undecided, but they're searching the Trump-Clinton polls, Trump-Clinton debate, Trump-Clinton election. They're really going for Trump all along, and they just don't haven't acknowledged it to themselves, or it hasn't reached conscious awareness. But
A bit like
One more question here,
yeah.
and then we're gonna turn it over to
So
Seth.
a bit like latency testing, where the degree of enthusiasm for a particular idea is measured in part by how quickly you respond to it in
Yeah.
milliseconds. And
Yeah.
so that's actually an example of combining conventional asking questions with behavioral measures to try to sort out the degree of certainty about a particular decision. There's a question back here.
Right. I actually have two related questions. First of all, I'm a big fan of yours, and I'm also a huge fan of Google search trend data. So along that line, I want you to comment on two things. One is you mentioned something like sometimes Google trend data is not adequate to address some of the requests from your mom, for example, the gun control thing. I think you're referring to public Google trend data. Can you comment on the possibility of imagine you can marry the search trend with on the user level, like if you can know who searched what they when after user search gun control, what else do they search, the demographics, if you know the user level data. The other question is kind of related, but another use case, which is what's your comment on the possibility of predicting some of the stock price, like certain hardware, for example?
So I think, so as the first question, if you had individual level data, I do think the data could get a lot better. And it might be marrying that with surveys in various ways, but I do think, yeah, like if you want to, I'm sure if you looked at people who are searching for Trump and you looked at all their searches, even if they never searched Trump, Clinton, or whatever, there are probably ways to figure out that someone doesn't like the candidate or someone does like the candidate, through all the different searches, if you really knew that. I still think it's hard because as far as like just a simple question, like how many people support gun control, there are some people who never make any searches around gun control, and they would be hard to, so that's where I think surveys are really good, that they can really say, like, everybody can now give their opinion, even if you've never made, you haven't thought about it in the last year or last month, or thought about it enough to make a search about it. So I do think that, like, it's very hard to go from the Google searches to what % of people think this is a very challenging thing, which I think polls are pretty good at. I think it's more just like these areas have more of it, or lots of other areas. And as far as predicting the stock market, I've looked a little bit into this. So the two questions I get are, can you predict elections? Can you predict the stock market? That's all anyone seems to care about in this country. But they're like, but I have looked at the stock market a little bit. I haven't had much success. I think the stock market is is pretty efficient in that the amount of resources that go into predicting the stock market are enormous. So if you want to do like a new study on what we can learn about suicide from Google searches, like the competition, there may be only 2 or 3 other people who've looked at that. If you want to do, can we predict Apple's stock based on Google searches? The brightest minds, the brightest minds in the world have all been looking at that question. So I think things get priced in pretty fast with public data in the stock market, and I haven't had much success. I had some success predicting like volume of search of trades. So if people are searching for buy gold or sell gold, like people are searching a lot for gold, then maybe gold's gonna be traded a lot in the future. And there's some things I talk about a little in the book. Some of the things I looked at. I also this is my father. All my parents are complaining about me. My father's really pissed that I'm not interested in the stock market since I've been a kid, and I just don't have that much interest in the topic. So I get really bored really fast, and then like go on to other topics. So I don't know. Probably people who are more interested in it, passionate about it, could maybe get some insights. But it's hard. It's really hard.
So one of the questions that occurred to me, I guess the standard sort of conventional wisdom in the survey field is that people tend to be better about, with the exception of socially desirable topics, which are mostly what you focused on in the book, they tend to be better at telling you something about their opinion than at telling you something about their behavior. With behavior, we don't really remember things unless they're super salient, and even things that are really salient, like surveys of when was the last time I got a vaccination or my kid got a vaccination. You run it up against administrative records and people just don't remember, or they misremember the time. So there are all these tricks in surveys about how to deal with that, of using, asking a general question about whether you did it and then asking in the last month, or sort of to squeeze out all the overclaiming, or other situations where you might be able to kind of get a better read on behavior. And in audience measurement, to the degree that it's possible, we've moved a lot toward more passive measurement because people do a bad job of filling out diaries or remembering what they watched. So, in that context, do you, as you've kind of rehabilitated your view of surveys and given them maybe a little bit more room, do you have a sense of how the opinion surveys themselves, that part of it, might actually be improved? Is there any practice that the people in the survey and polling field might consider that would make their surveys more accurate from your point of view?
Well, I think one of the reasons that, so if you do behaviors have been replaced by like observational data, it's because we actually have something. We have observational data, but you don't really have an observation of someone's opinion, right? Like you only have what they say. And I think that is one of the reasons that Google is powerful, is that you're going into this is actually into people's opinions in the human psyche and you know, their attitudes towards Black people. Like we wouldn't actually have how you feel about, you know, African Americans or something, and then they're, or how do you feel about your marriage or things like that. Right. Where now we do have some new measure, but you know, I do think, again, I think the future is going to be combining data sources, like definitely. So you want to kind of, I don't think it's exactly the research is all done like on this area, but I do think that ultimately you're going to be using the opinion data to get some sort of benchmark, and then you're going to somehow use different data sources to kind of say like how many people might be. I do think with opinions, a lot of people lie. Like if you say why you did things, I think a lot of people are lying to themselves in that case, and that is a huge issue. Or we don't know why we do things, or there are a lot of subconscious decisions we make. So that's
or they're making an opinion because they're being asked it, and they've actually never really considered it very deeply. I mean, that happens.
Also, it's not clear that's either an advantage or a disadvantage of surveys, because like I was saying with the Google searches, you can't really measure gun control because if someone's never searched gun control in the last year, but you can ask them, do you support gun control, and then make them think about it. Right. Which maybe is an advantage of surveys. I guess it's less accurate than someone who's constantly been thinking about it, but you might say that's a positive because, you know, like Google, you can't force people. If you're just watching what people do, you can't force people to think about a new question that they haven't thought about yet, but you can do that with surveys.
Right, right. Do you have any anticipation, like say, for example, iPhone 10 just came out with facial recognition. Okay, so that allows you to unlock the phone by at least recognizing you. But there's a lot of software out in the marketplace that says that it can actually read your opinions with facial coding. You know, they could register, you know, so I'm imagining, you know, 10 years from now where, you know, we'll be at conferences and people will be showing how they put a new product in front of people, and they didn't ask them in a focus group to respond to it. They like read their facial responses and are giving a behavioral readout on the new product idea. Do you think things like this are conceivable?
So my understanding, just from people knowing people who work in this field, is that like the whole like looking into the brain at least doesn't really work, and it's like a lot of cherry picking, pretending it works. Mm-hmm. But I think it could, in theory, work, which is why now Elon Musk is like investing in a company that does this. And I think there is more and more, like in the future, it is plausible that you can just read someone's brain waves and figure out what they're thinking, but it doesn't really work now. Yeah, maybe in the future. I don't know enough about the area, okay. But I know a lot of people, like, I once saw Danny Kahneman give a talk, and he said, like, if he could study any area, if he was young now and he could study any area, it would be looking inside the brain. And that's all the future to all these topics, is just measuring people's brain waves and figuring out what they're thinking that way. So it's possible. I just don't, I really don't know.
To the degree I understand it, it's mostly correlation analysis. You see some activity, you know, a certain thing lights up and it tends to happen in connection with some kind of stimulus. And so they say, it's activating that and making an inference from it. But it seems still silent movie time.
Yeah, and I saw like David Brooks in one of his books was like, he got really excited about neuroscience, and then he just like, the answer was always amygdala. Right. It's like he just gave up. I couldn't hear amygdala or whatever it is every time. So I don't know. I think it's definitely in its infancy, but I think logically, I guess it is.
Okay.
Plausible.
Seth, I love your book. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad we were able to work it out so you could come here. You didn't really cover this in the book, or if you did, I didn't underline it or I don't remember it, but any concerns about self-selection onto Google and how that might vary by topic? I don't know if you've thought through that, but I'm sure you have.
So there are two issues. There's one that just Google's population is not the same as, like, people don't use the internet, as been talked about with all internet data sources. So, you know, those issues are going to become less and less. And I think, they're already kind of not major issues. I might not use it. Actually, it was once when I was in my PhD program, I was just like, oh, I forget what the site was, but somehow you could measure the effects of food stamps using Google searches. And my advisor's like, I don't think the food stamp population, the Google search population are a great overlap. So, I think there are definitely use cases at this point if you're studying like the elderly or the poor and elderly, there might be issues with the population base. And then the other issue is that you search on Google because you don't have the information. So you could say, like, if my husband is my best friend or everything's going great in my marriage, I don't feel a need to look up anything about a marriage. Although some people do search my husband is awesome, which amazing, which I don't understand at all what they think Google's going to help them tell them in this scenario. Like, keep up the good work, I guess. But I think there definitely is that phenomenon. I think if you look at, there's definitely a bias. So if most data sets are biased towards the socially acceptable by a lot, I think Google is biased towards the socially unacceptable by a little, because for the very reason that you turn to Google because you can't tell anybody else. So it is a concern. I think it's, it also depends on the use. Again, like, I think the absolute numbers using Google searches to figure out how many people think X or are doing X, I think is not so great. But if you say that, how many people are racist just from how many people have made a racist search on Google, I don't think, a lot of racists don't make a racist search. And some people who aren't racist make racist searches. So it's not like a perfect one-to-one correspondence, but I think saying that this area has more racist than that other area, that you can do with much more accuracy. So I think, that's another reason. So I think that's another reason that Google will struggle with the question of what % of people think this, just using their search data.
You contrasted Google and Facebook. But most of your analysis has really been about textual data. A lot of what gets uploaded, of course, is photographic data, videos, and that's harder to code. It's harder to parse. We do a better job of analyzing language. Natural language processing is better developed than, say, diagnostics of photographs or video using machines. Do you see any way right now for marketers to make use of photographic data on platforms like Pinterest or Instagram and divine trends or get consumer insight from photographic data?
Yeah, definitely. You have to probably use AI to do that and machine learning. But I talk about one example in my book. There's this company, Premise, in San Francisco, which they have people in certain countries, in the developing world, economic variables are not very good, and they take a while to be released. And they have people with smartphones around the world in these developing countries basically just taking pictures of what's going on. And then they go back to their computer algorithm. They say, like, they literally measure like how ripe the apples are in stores. And they measure the prices they see on the baskets or how many apples there are in the basket. So all turning these pictures into some sort of data point and then saying how the economy's doing in these places where the other measures aren't very good. So that's like one use case. And, I think like, I was talking to a friend who works at Facebook and he was just doing like just a side project just for amusement, but you can like, what % of people have beards in different cities? Because you can just do like a simple AI thing is you just give a training data set of this person has a beard, this person does a beard, this person doesn't have a beard. You give them a certain number that it'll build a model to say, this is what a beard is. And then you can just extend that to every city in the country and say, this is how many beards there are based on the pictures of people. And that's pretty awesome. Like he wasn't thinking that in business case, but I'm sure there are actually like razor companies and stuff that would have, or in some other corporations that would have interest in that data. So all kinds of things like, yeah, definitely a hugely promising area of pictures. But you have to use AI. Yeah, for that it's AI machine learning. You can't just do like, it's not really easy to like do these simple analyses that I tend to do.
Right. Jane.
This is a little off from the research side of it, but you can't help but thinking, does Google have some responsibility when people are searching for how to commit suicide or how to kill somebody or how to build a bomb and all that? I'm sure you get these questions all the time. How do you deal with either providing that information to law enforcement in aggregate or, individual level privacy issues? There's so many issues
So I don't
surrounding
deal with
that.
these questions. Maybe if someone Google employee here deals with these questions, I don't know. All I know and nor do I know anything about this. All I know is what Edward Snowden
So,
said.
on the suicide one, we do things where we basically put up help and hotlines for results. There was another example where recently the results for rehab centers, we basically said we're not doing ads anymore because we felt like we weren't actually helping people with what was being returned. So there are definitely times when the social good is a big piece of it.
So I think one of the things we're going to learn from this data, we kind of imagine that if you had this data, you could like figure out who's going to predict a crime. If you saw Minority Report, it was all about data to predict a crime. And we kind of imagine that this data is going to all teach us like, oh, this is a 95% chance of a crime and stop all these crimes before they happen. I think if we actually like used all this data and built serious individual level models, the main learning would be that a huge percent of things that look horrible don't turn into any action. So like if you look at, for example, suicide searches, I'm working on this article now, and they're like, I think, I might have the numbers wrong, but I think there are 3.5 million suicidal searches on Google every month, and there are 4,000 suicides. So the vast majority, but even though at the area level, these are highly predictive, when these searches are higher, there are more people, but the vast majority of people who search for suicide never go through with the action. I don't have the individual level data where you could say maybe if some people keep on searching for it, they're more at a risk, but I think even so, there are probably a huge percent of people that probably a lot of people that we've been sending to mental hospitals, probably if we had the data science behind it, we wouldn't be sending them to mental hospitals. We'd be like, or, the people, the kids that we've been sending to juvenile, whatever, because they wrote some things about bombs. If we actually had the data behind that, we'd find, oh, that's actually not the risk we thought it was. It's not a 50% or 60% risk. It's a 1 in 1,000 risk or 1 in 10,000 risk. So it's just because over and over again, you see the number of searches are way more than the number of actions, like orders of magnitude more than the numbers of actions. So, so I always say, I think it's better to intervene at the area level than the individual level. So if we know that a lot of people in an area are searching kill Muslims, I think we should put extra security on a mosque. But I'm not sure we should be targeting the people who are searching kill Muslims because, it's not a crime to have a bad thought, and it's definitely not a crime if it only 1 in 20,000, leads to even a minor hate crime. So
I have 2 millennial daughters, and one of them said to me, "Mom, who needs a guru when you have Google?" So you can see the importance.
Over here.
Yeah.
I'm sure this is in chapter 1 of your book, but of course the first piece of quantitative social science was Emil Durkheim's suicide. But I do have a question. How can you tell? I'm almost thinking Google searches on suicide, wouldn't more of them come from mothers, fathers, relatives who are worried about somebody who's showing these tendencies rather than the people themselves?
Well, I mean, there are certain searches, how to kill yourself, that I think we think is an individual or whatever. But that's another one where it's the individual level data, I think, could be a lot more because we could be able to disentangle. To some degree, it doesn't matter. Maybe that's the reason that they're so predictive at the area level. So it doesn't matter if it's a parent or a friend making that search. With health conditions, that also comes up where they're very predictive of depression in an area. But it doesn't matter if it's the depressed person or their spouse checking up on them. It's still, there's more depression in that area when more people are making that search. But I think if you had the individual level data, you could probably disentangle and say, this is actually a person feeling that, or this is, a friend, a family member. And maybe in some situations that distinction would be important.
So
I'll try to, I'm sorry.
So any thoughts on the next book?
Well, one thing you learn about the publishing industry is all anybody cares. Everybody lies when they say they care about suicide or racism. All anybody cares about is how to improve their own life. So, which is basically the main question I got after real, how can I use this to improve my life? So they're pushing me, the publisher's pushing me to do a self-help, how you can improve your life with data. But I have absolutely nothing to say on the topic. But
Okay. Well.
Don't tell anyone I said that. If you're looking at the book, I'm sure it's going to be filled with brilliant
I'll put a
information.
Google alert up for whenever your next book comes out because I really liked your last one. So thank you. Thank you.